People believe winter only takes it, never gives back. But sometimes it leaves something unexpected behind. This is the story of a woman whose sorrow turned into resilience. Amid the harsh frontier of the American West, it all started with one small act of kindness. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The winter of 1897 descended on Jade Creek Valley like a debt finally called in. It came quietly without warning, frosting the window panes of the scattered wooden homes along the eastern ridge and glazing the naked cottonwood branches with ice that trapped the weak sun, holding it still as if daylight itself had been locked in place. Beyond the glass, the world dissolved into white snow, falling in a constant hushed veil. May Linwood stood at the kitchen window, her breath blooming faintly against the cold glass. Behind her, the cast-iron stove gave off the last honest warmth a few full logs could offer, and she knew exactly what those logs meant, half of what remained in the shed. The rest would have to endure until the thaw which the almanac promised would not arrive before late March. For months she had done her reckoning in silence, measuring supplies with the same care she once used for flour when baking Eli's favorite bread. He always said it tasted like his mother's kitchen back in Pennsylvania. Eli Linwood had been gone 18 months now. The sickness had taken him in the summer of 1896, along with 17 others from the valley, including the Pritchard twins and old Sam Worth, a man who had survived the war only to be claimed by a fever no one saw coming. May remembered Eli waking that final morning, his face pale as winter wheat, telling her he felt all right, just worn down. 3 days later, he was buried behind the Methodist church, where wildflowers bloomed each spring, though now snow piled quietly against the headstones. She had survived the first winter on what Eli had put away, the careful savings of a man who believed preparation was a form of survival. The second winter showed no such mercy. Summer crops failed, and what little she managed alone shriveled under drought, the soil splitting open, dry and desperate. Her small flock of chickens stopped laying in November. She sold them to the Webster family for less than they were worth because everyone knew her situation. And in Jade Creek Valley, charity often disguised itself as business. Now it was December 23rd. The cupboard held 2 cans of beans, a modest sack of cornmeal, and a jar of preserves she had been stretching since October. If she was careful, Christmas dinner would be beans and cornbread. There would be no ham, no sweet potatoes, no pie cooling on the windowsill, like every Christmas since she married Eli 12 years before. May turned from the window and studied the empty kitchen table, its surface polished smooth by years of meals and talk, bare wood showing through where the finish had long ago worn thin. She had scrubbed it the day before, though nothing rested on it. The motion had been automatic, her hands obeying memory rather than need. Silence filled the house, like weight. In the parlor, the clock Eli brought from Pennsylvania marked time without feeling each second falling away unnoticed. She once believed she might grow used to the quiet. 18 months proved otherwise. Some absences only deepened, sinking into bone and timber alike, making walls groan beneath what is no longer there. Outside, snow began falling again, light flakes drifting past the window as afternoon faded. The sky darkened to iron, and the cold would sharpen once night arrived. May drew her shawl closer and stepped toward the stove, meaning to add another log, then paused. Not yet. The cold could wait a little longer. The knock came as the last daylight bled from the sky, 3 firm strikes against the front door, measured and sure. May stood frozen in the kitchen, her hand still resting on the back of a chair. No one had come knocking in weeks, not since Martha Hale stopped by in early December with a basket of apples and that look women carried when they visited widows. half sympathy, half relief, that it was not their house standing too quiet, too empty. The knock sounded again firmer this time. May Linwood moved down the narrow hallway, her steps echoing against the bare boards. Through the small frosted pane in the door, she saw the outline of a man, tall, broad across the shoulders, caught in the dying light of dusk. She opened the door just enough, and the cold pushed inside like it belonged there. The man on her porch was Cole Barrett, her closest neighbor, though closeness meant little in Jade Creek Valley, where land stretched wide and stubborn. His place sat nearly a mile and a half west past the creek that split their properties. She had seen him perhaps a dozen times since Eli Linwood's funeral, always from afar, a lone figure working fields or riding toward town on his roan. They had never really spoken. Eli mentioned him once or twice, said he was a man who kept to himself. In Jade Creek, that could mean steadiness or trouble, depending on who was judging. May Linwood? He said now, his voice rough like stones shifting under water. He held his hat in both hands, snow dusting the shoulders of his coat. His face bore the marks of years spent outdoors, lines carved deep at the corners of his eyes. A thin scar cut above his left brow, pale against weathered skin. Mr. Barrett. May kept one hand on the door ready, if she needed it. A woman living alone learned caution early, even with neighbors. "I'm riding into town tomorrow for supplies," he said, not quite meeting her gaze, eyes fixed somewhere beyond her shoulder. "Thought I'd ask if you needed anything brought back. Roads are turning bad, and it's a long walk in this weather." The words settled between them in the cold air. May felt her chest tighten, that strange, aching sensation of being noticed after trying so hard to disappear. Pride was a thing she could no longer afford. Still taking help meant admitting need, and admitting need meant facing how far she had slipped from the life she once lived. "That's kind of you," she said carefully. "But I'm managing." Cole nodded once, slow and quiet. He turned his hat in his hands. "All right. The offer stands," he added. "If you change your mind, I'll be leaving at first." He was already shifting to go when May heard herself speak the words, rising from somewhere she didn't recognize, breaking through walls she'd built, piece by piece. "Mr. Barrett?" He stopped, half turned back. "Why?" The question was simple, but it carried everything she couldn't say. Why now? Why me? Why a kindness that felt too deliberate to be casual? He stood silent for a long moment. In that stillness, May heard wind moving through the cottonwoods and the porch boards creak under his weight. When he spoke again, his voice had softened. "My wife died 3 winters ago," he said. "Childbirth. The baby, too." He looked down at his hat, at hands too big and worn for such fragile truths. "Folks brought food, checked in on me. I didn't want any of it then. I figured I could handle it alone." He lifted his eyes to hers, and for the first time, May saw something she recognized, the deep fatigue of grief carried too long. "Turns out I was wrong. It took me a long while to understand that. But I did," he said. May Linwood felt her throat draw tight. She hadn't known about his wife, hadn't known the depth of what he'd lost. The valley guarded its secrets well. Every homestead stood like its own island of quiet suffering. "I don't need charity," she said, though her voice came out softer than she meant. "No," Cole Barrett replied. "But maybe you could use a neighbor." He set his hat back on his head and stepped down from the porch, his boots crunching into the fresh snow. May watched him go until the dark swallowed him whole, his shape fading to shadow, and then to nothing. Only then did she shut the door. She rested her forehead against the cold wood, sensing something loosen inside her, not hope not yet, but a faint fracture in the ice that had sealed her heart. That night, May did not sleep easily. She lay beneath the quilts Eli Linwood's mother had stitched for their wedding quilts that no longer held back the December cold, listening to the house shift and settle. Wind pressed against the windows, and somewhere inside the walls timber snapped and tightened with sounds like breaking bone. She thought of Cole's face, of the way his voice had gentled when he spoke of his wife and child, of the long years of grief he must have borne alone across the creek. She had built her widowhood like a fortress stone by stone, every refusal of help another block in place. At first it felt necessary, a way to preserve dignity when everything else had been stripped away. Eli had always been the one people gravitated toward, the one they asked for counsel or company. May had been quiet or content to remain in his shadow. After his death, she learned that shadows vanish without their source. She let herself fade, choosing invisibility over the sting of being pitied. But Cole hadn't offered pity. He offered recognition, one sorrow, acknowledging another across a distance they both understood. The difference was small, but powerful, and it disturbed something in her that had grown used to stillness. Morning arrived gray and cold. May rose before dawn, as she always did, and fed the stove with 2 precious logs. She brewed coffee from the last of her grounds, thinning it with extra water, and stood at the window while the sky slowly lightened, night retreating into a pale winter dawn that promised nothing. Christmas Eve. Once this day meant baking, roasting the goose, polishing the silver passed down from her grandmother. Eli would have hauled in extra wood, hung evergreen boughs above the doors. The house would have carried the scent of cinnamon cloves, bread lifting warm and alive. Now there was only weak wheat coffee, and the lingering bite of cold no fire could chase away. She was measuring cornmeal for what she'd settled on as her Christmas meal when she heard the wagon. The sound cut clean through the frozen air, the groan of wood, the jingle of harness, the steady beat of hooves on hard ground. May crossed to the window and saw Cole Barrett's wagon rolling up the drive. His roan horse pulling through snow drifted thick overnight. Her first instinct was to step back to pretend she wasn't home, but the thought was useless. Smoke curled from her chimney. And this, empty or not, was still her home. She wiped her hands on her apron and waited. Cole Barrett pulled the wagon in close to the porch and climbed down with the measured care of a man whose body had learned restraint the hard way. He reached into the wagon bed, lifted out a wooden crate, and carried it up the steps with steady intent. May Linwood opened the door before he could knock. "Mr. Barrett," she said. He held the crate against his chest, and she could see the tops of several items inside. A small sack of flour, some canned goods, something wrapped in brown paper, he said. "Picked them up in town. Figured you might make use of them, seeing as it's Christmas." May looked from the crate to his face. His expression was carefully blank, revealing nothing. Yet there was something in his eyes that reminded her of how Eli Linwood used to look when he tried to hide how much something mattered. "I can't pay you for this," she said quietly. "Not now. Maybe come spring." "No payment needed," Cole said gently, cutting her off. "Call it a neighborly trade. You helped my Anna once before she passed. Brought her tea. Sat with her when I had to ride into town. She told me about it," he added. "Said you were kind when she wasn't feeling well." May remembered the afternoon, though years had passed. She had visited Anna Barrett, brought chamomile tea, stayed an hour or two talking. Nothing more than one woman checking on another. It wasn't anything May said. She was carrying a child. Then Cole went on softly. "You didn't know. Neither did we, not yet. Within months, both Anna and the baby Noah were gone. It was something to her," he said. "And it mattered to me." He stood there with the crate, waiting. "Will you let me set this inside?" he added. "Or are you planning to keep me out here in the cold, arguing about it?" Despite the tightness in her chest and the sting behind her eyes, May felt the faintest hint of a smile. She stepped aside. Cole brought the crate into the kitchen and set it on the table, not lingering, not drawing attention to what he'd brought. "There's a ham in there," he said, nodding once. "Small but enough for a proper Christmas dinner. Potatoes, a tin of coffee, a few other things." May stared at the crate, this sudden abundance sitting in her empty kitchen like something borrowed from a parable. Her hands trembled as she gripped the table's edge. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely sound. Cole turned his hat in his hands, a habit she was starting to recognize. "Because I know what it's like," he said at last. "To be buried so deep in grief you can't see a way clear. To believe taking help means you've lost." He continued, lifting his eyes to hers. "And because nobody ought to be alone on Christmas, at least not if there's another choice." The words stayed between them, fragile and necessary. Tears pressed hard at the corners of May's eyes, a reflex she'd trained herself to suppress. But standing there on Christmas Eve morning in a cold kitchen with a near stranger who understood the exact shape of her loneliness, that restraint began to fail. "I don't know how to do this," she said, and she was no longer speaking about the food. She meant the larger, harder thing, how to allow herself to be seen in need, how to step back into the world as something more than a ghost drifting through the rooms of a former life. Cole Barrett nodded slowly, as if every word made perfect sense to him. "Neither do I," he said. "But maybe that's all right. Maybe we're both just learning as we go." He turned toward the door, then stopped with one hand resting on the frame. "I've got a goose roasting," he added, not quite meeting her eyes. "More than I can manage alone. If you wanted to bring some of that ham over tonight, we could share a meal. Seems a shame for both of us to be cooking by ourselves in separate houses." The offer sounded casual, almost careless, but May Linwood heard the thought behind it. He was giving her a way to accept, without feeling beholden, a way to dress kindness up as plain sense. It was generosity wearing the mask of practicality, and she recognized it. What time, she heard herself ask. 6 o'clock. Gives you time to fix things however you like. After he left, May stood in the kitchen for a long moment, staring at the crate on her table. Then, with movements that felt both unfamiliar and remembered, she began to unpack it. The ham lay heavy in butcher paper, solid and undeniable. 4 potatoes followed their skins, still dusted with earth. A tin of coffee that once opened released a rich, familiar scent that tightened her throat. There was a small sack of flour sugar folded into brown paper, a jar of honey, 3 apples, and at the bottom, wrapped carefully in cloth, a small loaf of bread, still faintly warm. She sat at the table and let herself cry quietly at first, then harder, her shoulders shaking from the strain of holding it back for so long. The tears were not only for the food, though that was part of it. They were for being seen, for having her struggle recognized by someone who understood its weight. They were for Eli Linwood and the life they once built, and for the brutal truth that the world kept moving even after everything you loved was taken. They were for Anna Barrett and her child Noah, for Cole's years of solitude, for all the ways grief walled people off while time went on without them. When the tears eased, May felt something she hadn't known in 18 months, a sense of purpose that reached beyond mere survival. She rose, fed the stove, and added wood without counting or guilt. She filled a pot with water and set the ham to boil, dropping in the last of her cloves. She peeled the potatoes and set them aside. She brewed coffee from the fresh grounds, strong and black, and drank it by the window, watching snow drift across the valley in patterns that felt almost intentional. The afternoon slipped by in a rhythm she had forgotten, the rhythm of preparing, of making something meant for someone else. She baked biscuits from the flour, small and golden, wrapping them in a clean cloth. She polished 2 apples until they shone. It was not the Christmas feast she once knew. but it was something an offering proof that she could still give even when she believed herself empty. As the winter sun sank early May changed out of her everyday dress and into the gray wool one she had worn to Eli's funeral. It was the finest thing she owned now, and though it carried painful memories, it felt right. She brushed her hair and pinned it neatly in place. When she glanced at her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand, she barely recognized the woman looking back. She was older, shaped by hardship, yet present in a way she hadn't been for months. At 5 o'clock, May Linwood wrapped herself in her heaviest shawl and set the ham, the biscuits, and the polished apples into a basket. The walk to Cole Barrett's homestead would take about 20 minutes through the snow, and the air had grown colder as daylight faded. She found the cold didn't trouble her the way it once had. It felt clean and sharp, a bracing reminder that she was still alive enough to feel it. The path followed the creek for half a mile, then bent west through a stand of cottonwoods that rose like sentries against the darkening sky. May hadn't walked this route in years, not since Eli Linwood brought her to meet the Barretts, shortly after they settled in the valley. That was 5 years back, maybe 6. Time blurred when measured only by seasons and loss. Snow crunched under her boots, her breath lifting in pale clouds that vanished almost at once. The basket weighed heavy in her arms, and twice she stopped to shift it, adjusting her grip. Overhead, the first stars appeared in the deepening blue, distant and startlingly clear. As she walked, May thought of the thresholds she had crossed in her life. Leaving her parents' home to marry Eli, stepping into the house he built for them, following his coffin to the cemetery. Each crossing had marked a passage from one self to another. This walk felt the same, though she couldn't say what she was moving toward or what she might be leaving behind. Maybe it wasn't one or the other. Maybe she carried both the grief and the chance of something beyond it. The cottonwoods opened onto bare ground, and Cole's house came into view, low and weathered smoke rising straight from the chimney. Warm light glowed in the windows, and the sight tightened something in her chest. It had been a long time since she'd walked toward a lit house that wasn't her own, longer still since her destination involved another person. Doubt crept in as she drew closer. What was she doing here? She hardly knew him. Before yesterday, they'd exchanged only a handful of words. What if she'd misread his invitation, mistaken plain country courtesy for something more? Even so, her feet kept moving. She crossed the snow-covered yard toward the porch, the smell of roasting goose reaching her now rich and inviting, mixed with wood smoke and something else, bread perhaps, or potatoes. She climbed the steps and stopped before the door, the basket heavy against her arms. For a long moment she stood listening to the valley's silence, the wide emptiness that could feel lonely or peaceful depending on how one held it. Then, before doubt could take root, she lifted her hand and knocked. The door opened almost at once, as if Cole Barrett had been waiting just inside. He stood framed by warm light, and when he saw her, his expression softened, not surprise but relief, as though he too had wondered if she would come. "May Linwood," he said, stepping aside. "You're welcome. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening, and for allowing this story to speak to your heart. The Wild West still holds countless truths, some painful, some tender, all worth remembering. Stay with us, subscribe, comment, and invite others to discover these untamed stories, from our hearts to yours. Thank you for being part of this journey. Aviso legal barra disclaimer. Each story shared here is produced for storytelling enjoyment. Certain scenes may include fictional or dramatized elements inspired by historical circumstances. Although AI tools assist us in visuals narration and script development, The emotional tone, editing, and quality control are conducted by people to ensure meaningful experiences. We fully uphold YouTube's policies, using no deceptive recreations or impersonations of real individuals. All creative resources are properly licensed. Unauthorized copying, re-uploading, or remixing is not permitted. Thank you for supporting the effort behind every episode we create.